Good afternoon, class. This taped lecture is in lieu. I have another appointment and I will be unable to do the class in person, so I'm doing the taped lecture. The content of today's lecture will be the idea of the response that takes place after you have had the Taiping Rebellion. But before we get into the area having to do with other kinds of issues, the Chinese do try and make some adaptations to what I would say are the normal responses of restoring their own dignity. They understood that there was something wrong with their military structure. They understood that there was some generous animosity toward the Manchu government. They understood that there was an anti-foreign element. So part of the storyline in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, while everything else is going badly, and before the Boxer Rebellion occurs, there was an attempt to try and do some changes internally. It's often referred to as a reform movement. Sometimes the Chinese use the word self-strengthening, an idea that they were going to do it themselves without assistance. So, if it's a reform-based activity, it has two sole prongs. It says, first, they're going to try and reconstruct the Chinese society according to modern times. Not to get rid of everything, but to reconstruct. Take the good, keep it, get some of the discarded features or the antiquated programs, and perhaps modify them, and in some instances, eliminate them. Secondly, it was an attempt to suppress rebellion. Well, they were unsuccessful because the Boxer Rebellion is looming in the future in 1900. But the attempt was made. So we'll take a look and see what kind of activities they chose and whether or not they had any kind of success whatsoever. First and foremost, it's a call to reform using Western technology. So does everyone agree to the idea of Western technology? The answer is no. But it's very clear that some Western technology, especially in lieu of military prowess, has to be initiated. To preserve a Chinese way of life, they're going to have to integrate some Western education. That means schools, that means technology. They have to do some things, even in the methodology of how they prepare themselves to meet with the foreign nationals. There was also a group that said what has to be done is a small form of cooperation between government that is Chinese-based and governments that are foreign national-based to try and work out some solutions rather than simply having, after the Taiping Rebellion and after the Opium Wars, having everything imposed on China from outside. So some of the ideas that are going to be brought forward would be, first and foremost, to try and build armaments. And they were going to develop manufacturing techniques to build guns, ammunition centers, and ships. Ships of the line that could perhaps counter the Western technology, because it had become evident that there was a gunboat diplomacy. This idea of the Europeans coming in with gunboats that were far superior to anything Chinese had, especially Chinese junks, which are inland waterway activities and not really secure for ocean transportation, nor were they armed. So they have to make some adaptation there. So arsenals and shipyards are part of the idea of the reform movement. The reform location was Shanghai and Fuzhou, two cities on the ocean-based, local, and yet not necessarily near Beijing, not necessarily near Canton, with the interpretation being that they could do it here in relative isolation, and if they needed the Western technology, they could hire it from the outside and bring it in. Secondly, they had to have some kind of foreign service office. It would be a necessary ingredient we might call the Department of State. Theirs was an attempt at least to have someone at a rank level that wasn't part of the imperial court, not the emperor, not the grand secretary, not someone of the ministerial level, but somebody who could, in a sense, be skilled in foreign affairs. It means they had to know language, probably had to have traveled abroad, they have to have some interaction with the Europeans, and those individuals were relatively few and far between, but nonetheless, the attempt started in the late 1860s to try and achieve this goal. Third, schools for Western languages and Western technology were established. Some of them were established in old temples. Some of them were established simply in government housing. But an attempt was made to actually have Western language and technology taught simultaneously. Now, there had to always been an attempt on the part of some people in China to do this, translate Western skills that were technologically based. there were hundreds and hundreds of documents that had been translated, many of them translated by Protestant missionaries who had acquired the skill sets of the language. They came in, did the translations, but the particular location of where these translations occur became somewhat lost. The fact that they were done and then not distributed was also an unfortunate circumstance. But there had always been attempts made, but now the idea of self-strengthening was saying it has to be done formally, it has to have government support, has to be pursued and processed by government personnel. So, who are the leading figures in some of these ideas of self-strengthening? A man by the name of Tseng Kuo-fang, Tsengkuo-Fang, was one of the leading figures. He is doing it pretty much not for self-serving purposes, but simply as one of the innovators in the self-serving or the self-strengthening movement. Secondly, there was, and again, not an official support from the Empress Dowager Tu Shi, but an unofficial acceptance that something had to be done, and it was her political savvy and her willfulness to say, let's do it, but hold it. Let's get ready, and then if we need it, we'll probably implement some of this Western technology, some of this Western science. But it wasn't necessarily saying she is the one who is forcing the issue. It is coming from governors, governor generals, and viceroys in the surrounding countryside. And it's not necessarily coming from the group that would have been the ministerial supporters of the emperor, and certainly not a group of the individuals called the Iron Hats. The Iron Hats were the men who were appointed to the positions of the great ministries, the Grand Secretariat, the Censorship, Ministry of Rights, those kind of figures. In a general sense, the Asian state system, which had been a tributary system, also comes under consideration for review. It became apparent that something was happening in almost every regard that was an imposition of value sets placed on the Chinese in which they had little or no input. So, the merchants who had been the Kohong are not necessarily going to be engaged as the continuing entities for future trade and commerce. And the British government is going to try and make more and more concessions back to their own merchant families, the Jardine Mason Company, the East India Companies. They're going to have greater latitude. What's going to happen is you're going to have confrontations, you're going to have disputes, you're going to have a variety of concerns. So some courts were established having to do with external affairs, meaning affairs with Chinese to foreign nationals. And it would grow in sophistication, it would grow in complexity. I'll send you a small chapter to let you take a look just how complex it was. It's fascinating, but it's also almost to the emphasis of minutiae and triviality about things that the Chinese interpreted, especially in the interpretation of Western language, as to what it meant when placed into Chinese terms, or what Chinese language meant, which were translated into Western documents, treaties, commercial arrangements, legitimate recognition of territories, what we might call matters of tort, a claim. So, there have been inroads into China that became such noteworthy. We talked about the big ones, the idea that they had to bring in foreign nationals to subdue the Taiping Rebellion. But they're also going to have loss of territory. And part of the loss of territory is going to focus on this idea of the need to be more strong, self-strengthening. The Japanese had moved in the late 1870s into the Ryukyu Islands, R-Y-U-K-Y-U, the Ryukyus, that's north of Japan, and Formosa. The British, once again, had arranged an agreement on new territories other than just Hong Kong, and the new agreement was called the Chifu Agreement. C-H-E-F-O-O, the Chifu Agreement, C-H-E-F-O-O Agreement, 1875-76. There was an agreement that was drafted by the French over the territory that they, the French and the Chinese, called Annam, which is today Indochina, which is really Vietnam. But now the French are holding, in a sense, a significant territory in South Asia that had been a tributary state to China. So with all of these new threats, the Chinese say they have to have a navy. and then secondly, an army. It was interesting how they placed the order of militancy. The outside entity was the Western powers, but they still feared the inland enemy, which might have been somebody other than the Manchus, Mongols, other tribes, especially in the Xinjiang province to the far east. Technically, one of the greatest enemies that Japan or China would face is Japan. And that argument is over Korea. And the Japanese are forcing themselves into Korea in the 1880s up through 1895. Both China and Japan had rather vast interest in Korea. They had it for material goods. That's where some of the mines are located, coal and iron ore, others. China had always seen Korea as, in a sense, an extension of one of the provinces of China, and they had supported the Koreans in many more ways than the Japanese. The Japanese were an interloper. They were an aggressor. So when the Chinese fight the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, one of the losses will be Korea. And it will be considered a pathway for Japan to do just what they will eventually do. Go up Korea, come into Manchuria, and invade China from the north. There would also be the destruction of the Chinese Navy. So what had started out as Plan 1, let's build a Navy, and then Plan 2, let's build an army, the loss of their Chinese Navy was a great setback. And this is 1895, so they are going to have to start again. They had lost a great deal of revenue, time, and energy in their naval aspirations, and it didn't come forward very easily. Another humiliation was the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Shimonoseki was an amendment treaty put on the Japanese and the Chinese by outside forces. The United States got involved, Russia got involved, Germany got involved, France got involved. Everybody had a little bit of interest in the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, primarily to protect China. The assumption was that China was being raped, was being taken apart, territory by territory by territory. And John Hay, Secretary of State for the United States, had put forward the concept of an open door policy, that the policy would say you could have your spheres of influence, but what you should not have was simply an overwhelming desire to physically acquire property and take it and do with it as you please. So some places, if you read histories, they talk about carving the melon, an intensification for concessions, new spheres of influence, other new territorial arrangements, much as the British had with Hong Kong. So in many ways, the Chinese had to have some support, some practical assistance, and it was very, very shallow and not forthcoming. Let me speak just for a moment about how attitude is also a part when you talk about reform. So if you're talking about reform, the great reforms probably start in 1895 and run through 1898, right before the Boxer Rebellion. The degrees of reform are now bringing into sharp contrast the old traditional Chinese and the modernists, the ones who would like to see some modification or change. There have to be some ways in which change starts so that it'll work, and reforms in every way are probably not going to miss any aspects of Chinese life. It'll be political, it'll be economic, it'll be military, educational, cultural. Every aspect you can think of is going to be affected in some way, shape, or form. How are we going to do it? In 1895 up through 1898, hundreds of imperial edicts and memorials are drafted and written. Recommendations are coming from a number of very aggressive Chinese who say if reform does not change, China would disappear as a nation. Emperor would once again be brought down to the life of a commoner, and he would be penniless, and he would live a life of penury and poverty. The ancestral homeland system was not sufficient to take care of the concerns of the present day. So, what were they going to do? Specifically, they said one of the biggest targets would have to be a change to the examination system. Practical subjects would have to be incorporated into the curriculum. Contemporary issues, studies of economics, levels of mathematics, business curriculum, they would have to have some curriculum that was pragmatic, applied science. They would have to be of Western background, Western disciplines, along with Chinese subjects. You'd have to change the situation where the students coming into these programs would be made aware that they are of necessity having to be schooled in the new technologies, in the new subject matters, and they would find a new measure of how to grade, score, and award those who successfully completed patterns of study. Second, it was believed that there would have to be locations affirmed as schools so that people would know where to go. Once again, send their brightest and best students there and make attempts to say you don't necessarily fail if you're now learning Western technology rather than the Confucian classics in every regard. The belief also was that you could learn the new technology faster than the 18 to 20 years that was a normal pattern for studying for the exams in the old order. Next, there would have to be an encouragement for the ability of people in the society to have access to a free press, and that there had to be some changes made in the application of information. So periodicals, publications of a variety of sources are going to be made not only by those in leadership among and above themselves, but also to the general populace. This is going to be a difficult feature, but the Chinese would actually work it out to a certain degree. They eventually established posting boards, and you could get news of information that was taking place that had been sent around by word of mouth, now is printed almost on a daily basis in a poster format. This is pretty much what you had in Europe going back into the 1700s, early 1800s. So China's catching up, but it's still behind significantly in that time period. You're also going to have to specialize new branches of government ministries to take care of the new features. We're going to have people who are engaged in the category of commerce, buying and selling of goods. We're going to have specialized bureaus, people who are interested in mining and development of technologies having to do with steel, a variety of the industries that would probably be supportive of railroads. They're going to have a continuation of building of ships. They're going to have a nationwide change in how information is transported, not in the old order, but a postal system, means of getting information from place to place. They're probably going to have to do one other thing that was going to be the most difficult of all, the abolition of sinecure positions. A sinecure, S-I-N-E-C-U-R-E, a sinecure. I have a sinecure position. I have tenure at university, which means I have, in a sense, lifelong employment. Hopefully, I am a reasonable faculty member. I'm engaged in the study of the material. I try and keep current. I have spent years in study. I try and produce information that is plausible, factual. I give the information in as open a sense as I can. I try and give both positions, etc. But from a sinecure, what if I were a completely biased individual, extreme in one sense or another? Unfortunately, we have some of those in university as well. But the position of sinecure was from the high level to the lowest level. And sinecure at this point is directed at the class of people we will call gentry. The gentry class, those who had passed the exams, but now weren't posted as a mandarin, but still, for practical purposes, had certain privileges, exemption from taxes or paying at a reduced rate. And they also had privileges within access to government officials, even though they were expected to provide what we would call social services, work on the irrigation programs, help on improvement of dams, saw to it that granaries were full when time of famine might be forthcoming. But still, the sinecures were to be abolished. That meant that the old system of who got power and then who kept it was going to have to be changed. You're going to have a centralization of a fiscal system. You're going to have money coming into the central government at district levels, at provincial levels, at prefectural levels, and it's going to have to be effectively collected and then prioritized as to how the funds will be dispersed. You're going to have some kind of standardization of what to do with the state allowances given to the Manchu bannermen, the people who came from Manchuria and lived a life of separation inside of China because they had been the successful conquerors of China back in the 1600s. They belonged to the Banner tribes, and they were given special status. But these reforms required a great deal of upheaval of what had been the Chinese system for almost 250 years. Now, having heard that and having said that, it's one thing to suggest you're going to have it, but is it going to be successful? So, I will give you the answer in advance. It's the failure of the reform system. It's an attempt, but it does not work. So, everybody reacts to the defeat of the Chinese Navy when the Japanese succeed. Everybody is angry about the integration of Western technology into the Confucian exam system. Everybody is upset about the possibility of tampering with the old orders of ancestor worship and filial piety. But it's not so much a destruction of the old as an imposition of the new. So, who goes against the reform? Well, the answer should be obvious. The literati, the people who had spent their life, had understood the exam system, had passed or didn't pass, at least attempted to pass, and were given classification of certain status. The ones who did pass and were not made mandarins, the ones who are mandarins, everybody who at one point or another was adapted to a lifestyle of leadership based on a study of the Confucian classics. There had to be a reform of some kind, both preserving the old but understanding that new nationalism is coming to China and it's going to have to be integrated in some fashion or another. We're going to have to take the idea of Confucianism as a faith. It's not. It's a philosophy. It's not a theology. But the order of relationships between the emperor and the citizen, between husband and wife, between friend and friend, between brother and brother, it's going to have to be, in a sense, revisited in one sense or another. So what comes in the place of these things are reformed societies. There are going to be, in a sense, reformers who are going to try, especially in 1898, to try and promulgate reforms, to spread the news, to publicize, to explain, to try and say what is going on to a huge population, especially to reform the military system as China is weak and needs to be protected. And since they've lost the Navy, they have to at least work with the Army. They have to reform the central administration of government. You can no longer spend all of your time sending memorials to the emperor, waiting for somebody to read it, waiting for the emperor to respond to it, waiting for somebody to send it back down to respond to a question. It has to be done more significantly, more professionally, and in a quicker and more timely fashion. The idea was that there would have to be some studies made to reinvigorate society without destroying the old social order. But the new reinvigoration talked about individualism, egalitarianism, democracy, words that had not been brought forward in quite some time and were considered, in a sense, so reactionary that it was beyond the scope and the power of society to perhaps sustain itself as a political entity if these were the principal methods that we're going to have to do, especially the idea that everybody's equal. That everybody is going to, in a sense, come forward with some form of success. So, self-strengthening is not going to succeed, and the idea that there had been an opportunity for it, and it was taken, and it didn't work, should not be interpreted that the Chinese were completely unaware that it was going to be a problem if they didn't address certain issues. But we have to go back and probably say, if it's ideological, and a lot of this is, that the ideological struggle turned out to be a Christian versus Confucius struggle. The conflict is, in a sense, a problem that says, when the missionaries come in, they are the ones who perform a lot of the work of the foreign powers as teachers, as ministers of health programs, of trying to do social reform. They are, in a sense, the entity that gradually spreads the idea of, or the seeds of, rebellion and revolt in many ways. The Taiping being the obvious example. Their activities did so many things to undermine what would have been the Manchu government. So there's a whole body of literature called the Chinese, or rather the Christian occupation of Chinese society. It came from a great many who were Protestant ministers who were very much interested in the activities of the border states on the waterways of the great cities, the Shanghais, the Fuchows, the Ningpos, and the Canton, Guangzhou, and Nanking. It was an understanding that with the missionaries coming in, that they brought forward, in a sense, the skill sets for some of these rebellions to at least begin. Because they talked about the reform of what had been, in many Western ideas, certain unholy barbaric customs, foot binding for Chinese women, the status of women in general. Now remember, there's no suffragette movement in Europe yet. We're still talking about things that have not come forward, and it's going to turn into the 1900s before the suffragette movement is strong. But the degradation of Chinese women, especially Chinese babies that were girls, some of them having difficulty being accepted into families, the loss of standing once you left your family to go somewhere else. If we were going to say anything that was taking place as a result of Christian intervention, is the demoralization of the old order, the demoralization of the Confucian-based system of government. Talking about the inability to challenge the conduct of the rulers, the officials, the leaders in either your family, in your community, or in your nation. That certain people were given who had superior positions and privilege, the prestige, and that the institutions were sacrosanct. You couldn't change them. You couldn't make any kind of reputable alteration to what was. This led to a demoralization in many ways. The moral disaster especially was bound around the opium addiction. The Chinese simply wanted an end. They wanted a cessation of the trade. They wanted to have their society brought back to good order. And who was at fault? Somebody has to accept the responsibility. You could blame the foreign national, but it was the weakness of the government. It was the weakness of the family structure. It was the weakness of the Mandarin system that didn't, in a sense, resolve the issue. And it goes on and on and on. So part of the Taiping Rebellion was, in a sense, a reaction. That's where you get the anti-Manchu, the anti-foreign response, and a saying that it's going to lead to other kinds of activities. This demoralization is rather obvious. If we take a timeline and we would say the major turning points are probably going to go from 1900 to 1911. And some of the features of the major turning points, we could say, were first and foremost in 1904. New school reform is mandated nationwide with a real challenge to the examination system. It took a year, but by 1905, the old exam system is abolished. A major change. In 1906, 6 of the major ministries were changed and made modern with new names for commerce. For the old rights ministry, for example, would be eliminated. In 1908, a constitutional government was proposed. Didn't mean it was coming, but proposed. In 1909, a National Assembly was proposed, called a provisional set of assemblies. By 1910, those provisional assemblies that were tentative became fixed, and in 1910 you had an assembly of, in a sense, provincial assemblies or elements brought together, and they meet collectively. While this is going on, there is an attempt to say, is the old order gone? And officially, in 1911, the Manchu dynasty collapses and is gone. So from 1901 to 1911, we take a look at things in a different sense about what are the activities that are going on to bring about the change. So it's a hard thing to say, but you have to do it in a manner that you really keep order, stability. And the Boxer defeat had left China in disarray, physically, governmentally, economically, in almost every category. So, officially, the dynasty lasts until 1911, primarily because after the Boxer fiasco, there was no entity to replace it. So the time period from 1900 to 1911 was an attempt to try and figure out what kind of a system do you want. As I mentioned to you in last class, do you want another dynasty, which is the normal way? You get rid of one dynasty because they lost the mandate of heaven. They no longer have the right to govern. Do you want to try a new system, a republic? Do you want to try a new system, a military dictatorship? Do you want to try a breakup of China back to its old components before it's unified and go back to a system of warlordism, where all regions of China are, in a sense, governed by some warlord, some military official in a small region? Are you going to have some kind of understanding of what's going to take place between the external forces that are coming in? Are they to play a role in the reformation of the government of China? So, what really starts to say you can use models or some ideas of what could be done to bring order to disruption is that the coastal parts of China suddenly try to say, we will modernize first and then the interior. So, coastal China is going to perhaps meet some of the response that's going on at this time. In the buildup of forces that are going to take place, we might talk about 3 stages that took place. And one of the first stages was that going back as early as the mid-century of the 1800s, so let's say 1850, 1858, I use 1865 because that's the end of the Taiping Rebellion, but some authors use different ones. But let's say, just for practical purposes, from 1850 to 1911, there's a group of gentry, the elite. For the most part, they support the dynasty and don't want any change, and they are opposed to everything from a Taiping to the foreign nationals to anybody who is a reformist. And that is one stage. So there is constantly a group of individuals, in a sense, pro-offering what needs to be is a better gentry class, a better Mandarin system, a better and a more effective, in a sense, empress to replace Tu Shi, and to get back to the old possible ways that within a short time, the interest on the part of the West is going to dissipate. They've had their money from opium and they're going away. Well, that was certainly a short-sighted view in terms of social forces. So various militias are set up by the gentry class with soldiers who are personally loyal to the gentry being recruited and brought in, financed by the gentry class, and taxed by the gentry on the locals. So this is without central government's approval. So you have, in a sense, an interior gentry class that is extreme in their old support. So we would call them the ultra-conservatives, the traditionalists. A second group comes along after the Taiping Rebellion. We call them the Reconstructionists, and they became a gentry elite who, in many ways, want to become changers in some fashion, but to integrate with the merchants, integrate with the Western commercial interest, and they try to, in a sense, bring in some of the commercial industrial technology. They too are looking for some kind of program, and they're going to do it through urbanization on the coastal areas. And then the third stage will be the rise of nationalism, an urban elite who now want to have localized self-government, constitutionalism, Western technology, and a variety of other forms of activity. These are the Chinese themselves, and they are split in areas, they are split in ideology, they are split in standing and profession. For the most part, in my opinion, the Taiping Rebellion is the catalyst for some kind of change, but it's difficult to say what kind of change it would be. So one, let's say that you're the really ultra-traditionalist, and you're going to revise and revitalize Confucian ideology of social order in relationships between people. How is the scholar official going to do all this? A difficult feature, to say the least. And what really works well is if you have sufficient funds to, in a sense, continue this idea of Confucian ideology. It's a long process to learn the scholarship material, learn the brushstroke, make it, in in a sense, of such a level. Remember, I've told you, not every time you took the exams you passed, even though you did well. They just didn't take any scholars in, didn't have any positions available. The immediate purview of something like this for, in a sense, keeping the old order is you still have an intrusion coming in, and it requires a military that is updated and modernized. To keep archers and horsemen on cavalry, if the British and others had brought in a huge army, then the Chinese probably would have been successful. But if it's going to be a naval function, it's not being fought. It's like apples and oranges. You're not working in the same pattern of activity. If you're looking for the group that would like to see, in a sense, post-Taiping Rebellion, we might call this as an elitist group during the post-rebellion recognition that there's going to have to be some kind of reconstruction of society. You have this urban gentry class. They talk about almost Adam Smith's laissez-faire. Let's have minimal intrusion on the part of government. Let's let the economic system work. And let's make the Chinese more free in the marketplace, buying and selling of goods. There are gentry who want to become, in a sense, involved in the trade and commerce as private entrepreneurs, not necessarily having to sustain government, mandarins, all the structure of society by passing on a portion of their goods and their services and their fees. But they also need that they're going to try and do something about producing new scholars in a different way. So if you're this post-Taiping group, the second group, somewhere between 1865 and 1911, they will produce some 565 academies. Academies that would be, in a sense, privately funded. They will be sponsored by the gentry class in various areas, either through land endowments, trust funds, rents, some subsidies in one sense or another, and they're going to be a new group of highly trained individuals who are, in a sense, extra bureaucratic. They're going to be skilled in Western trade and commerce. They're going to be skilled in what are the needs and interests on the part of the Western entities coming in and what they can do to make China strong internally. They are more, in a sense, not going to be the land-holding gentry who had rural militarization as a feature, but rather urban and interested in doing some things on the coastal areas. They also have a factor that perhaps for many was a disturbing feature, namely that they were working and understanding what the Japanese had done and using it as a model. What the Japanese had done was modernize and not get caught up in the drug trade, not get forced into the opiate trade. They decided that there was a model here you could follow, and what Japan was doing was modernizing between 1860, 1870, 1880, and they were building armaments, and they were building navies, and they were getting into mining, and they were industrializing, and they were producing steel. And is this the model? Could China follow such a model? For many, it was okay to say that they might follow a model, but it was terrible to have to say that it could be led by another Asian power, Japan, who had once been one of the subservient tributary states. The last group also decides that you need to have some understanding of the Western systems in areas such as political parties, constitutional standing, and if that is to be the case, there's going to be a tremendous struggle here to try and modernize the society in this regard. So there's a rising nationalist sentiment forced against the court. Well, the court sends some emissaries abroad to try and see what, if anything, we could learn. They visit the United States, Germany, England, France, and yes, they go to Japan. They come back and have public discourse. And slowly, the government decides to have a modern central government. And the 6 boards are going to be, in a sense, expanded. We're now going to have foreign affairs, civil appointments, internal affairs, finance, rights. But here we go. Education, war, agricultural-industry-commerce, post and communication dependencies. We're going to have a foreign service office. We're going to, in a sense, have a popular assembly made available that would, in a sense, be able to move quickly their memorials and their petitions to the central government for consideration. The Empress Dowager was considering a set of constitutional principles over a 9 to 10 year period that would prepare the society for the transfer into some kind of constitutionally based government. And here's an old warhorse, Tushi, looking at the possibility that, in a sense, she's going to give up some of her authority. And how is it to be done? Who is to be appointed to these various positions? And to go completely against the nominal distaste of Western society, Western technology, Western political system, primarily because it had been forced upon them in the general sense. So, what do you wind up with? You wind up with a series of insoluble problems that are almost overwhelming. Do you or don't you really accept as matter of government support building of railroads, of putting in factories, of establishing new ministries, of changing the educational system, of reforming every part of the system of what had been the Han government that the Manchus had come in and overwhelmingly simply had military officers sit side by side in a dual role. If they're going to do this, the new side-by-side officials are going to be Westerners. You're going to need Western skills, Western technical officials. You're going to need Western political figures. You're going to need Western educational figures to come in. And most of all, you are so damn weak, you have almost no fiscal support. You're going to need to borrow funds because you have paid indemnities out at a huge rate. The financial reforms are going to threaten everybody's, what is always called the rice bowl, how you live economically day to day. What's going to happen to local tax collectors? What's going to happen to the tax records and the idea of squeeze, graft, a small siphoning off of various amounts? There have always been, in a sense, an allowance for a distribution of the collection of funds at a variety of levels, even at fixed levels, but there had not been, in a sense, a single fiscal authority in China for several hundred years. So, revenues, in general, turn of the century, on the books, would say $70 million in U.S. funds, which is a surprisingly small amount of money for a large country, even in turn-of-the-century times. Receipts, records, all kinds of tallies have always been, in many ways, falsified. And while they were listed and while they were recorded, they were not accurate. The revenue from the Maritime Customs Union should have been integrated into the government, but it was handled separately, and it was used for foreign indemnities and loan payments and, in a sense, custom functions that were simply between the custom port facilities and the Western powers. So if you're trying to say how to run a government, they did not have a national budget. They did not have a national revenue of income and outgo. What they had was a crisis situation. When you have a crisis situation, you then have the crisis. So you then have the revolution of 1911, the collapse of the society. You have attempted reform and failed. You have attempted to integrate both the interior and the exterior and the coastal areas. You have attempted to change the examination system, but when you change the examination system, the presumption was you are striking at the heart of society. You were saying that the old ways were no longer valid. The fact that they still operated and still functioning were not well received by the general populace because they had always presumed there was going to be great things coming from somebody from within their little village, studying the exams, passing the exams, and having one of the mandarins come back and support that little community in a way that would be beneficial to all. They were also an agrarian society, a wet culture society. Wet in the south, millet, wheat in the north, but still an agrarian society. Now they have to become quasi-integrated with a maritime society. They have to develop, in a sense, a trade commerce facility. They have to get into manufacturers. They can do so, but it's not something that is native to them, and they feel awkward about the transition. They also don't like the sharing of power with local people on a fixed level called an assembly, or something where there are political parties where individuals are elected. Those are always appointed positions, appointed through a head of the clan, a head of the family, a head of a class. And now, the idea of the old patrician system of privilege to govern is being challenged in a number of ways. We'll pick up the next sequence of activities when we talk about the revolution starting in 1911 and the dictatorship of Yuan Shikai and some of the problems that he faced. And hopefully some of the readings that I send you will give you a clearer picture of what I spoke about today and where we're going forward, getting ready for that next test sequence that'll come up in a couple of weeks. All right, have a good day and thank you.